I spoke last time about reactive or defensive aggressiveness or destructiveness. That is to say, the reaction of man and animal to a threat of vital interests, of his vital interests. And I was trying to show that this is in itself a principle, a biological principle of survival, developed in the whole process of evolution, creating certain neurophysiological and physiological mechanisms, and that the difference between man and animal in this respect does not lie in the fact that man obeys a different law, but that by the fact of his awareness, of his capacity to foresee, by his capacity of formulating symbols, he feels a threat to vital interests much more frequently than the animal does. Or to put it differently, that he has many more vital interests than the animal has, namely not only the vital interests of the clear and present danger to his life, to his food supply, and so on, but the vital interest to his symbols, to his highest values, to all that which makes him not to fall to pieces or become insane. But on the whole, this kind of destructiveness, that is to say the reactive destructiveness, follows, you might say, a rational pattern of survival and is to be perfectly rational from the biological standpoint of the individual and the group. Tonight I want to talk about an entirely different kind of destructiveness, which transcends the interest of survival, which goes beyond the defense of life or other vital interests, in which indeed constitutes another type of destructiveness which is probably unique for man because it is related to the very specific qualities of man. Perhaps I could begin by talking about some premises and raising the question, what is man? Or we should better say, who is man? Well, you know from the bestseller The Naked Ape that man is essentially a naked ape, and that the rest isn't important, not worthwhile for zoologists to study or to pay much attention to. But is man really a naked ape? Well, of course, all these things are difficult to prove. But let me begin perhaps with a few simple definitions of man which have been expressed throughout history. The first definition of man is perhaps man as a homo faber, man as the animal that can produce tools. Well, that is perhaps not so very impressive because animals, the primates, can produce tools too. It's not a terribly impressive achievement, and in fact, man has produced tools before he became what is called the Homo sapiens, the knowing man. Well, here a great deal depends what we mean by sapiens. Do we mean intelligence or do we mean reason? Do we mean intelligence in the sense in which I was quoting that from a statement by Goethe, namely the understanding of dead things in order to manipulate them, or do we mean reason, the understanding of something which is not dead but alive, and which we don't see from without, and not for the purpose of manipulating it, but for the purpose of our truly understanding it. Well, the animal has certainly much intelligence for manipulation of things. There are so many observations about the primates in this respect that it's hardly necessary to give examples. And so has man, of course, although sometimes he produces things which threaten to destroy him. Man as an animal or as a being which has reason, well, that is already a much more difficult problem, and sometimes indeed one may doubt it. Sometimes indeed it sounds as if we live in a madhouse with a great deal of intelligence but with very little reason. I quoted to you the other day the title of a paper by a scientist who said, the title was, Are There Intelligent Beings on Earth? Now let me suggest another definition of man. We might define man as a homo esperans, the being that can hope, that is capable of hoping. And we might say hoping is a very specific human quality and human potential. We might say that hope is a psychic equivalent of growth. I can grow and be alive and march forward only in as long as I hope. If I have given up hope, I am really dead. And perhaps I can give up hope only under one condition, that I am convinced that when I am dead, I stay alive. And that is what the pharaohs believed, and many others believed would happen to them. Well, if one is convinced of the indestructibility of the body, then one might live without hope, but with the certainty that one doesn't need hope. Otherwise, hope is a very specific human phenomenon, and the collapse of hope is in individuals and in societies, perhaps one of the most severe symptoms of illness. You might give another definition of man. You might call man the homo negans, the being that can say no, that can negate. Perhaps one of the most important qualities of man, that he can say no. To say yes is very easy. We all can do that. To say no when our reason or our love or our sense of justice requires to say no, that indeed is a very high human achievement. And eventually you might use a definition of man which has been given by a great scholar Huizinga, namely homo ludens, the playing being. The being that has no purposes, that wants to play and enjoy the purposeless activity. Well, we see that very much in children. We see it perhaps in some animals. So it may not be an exclusively human quality, but it is certainly a very important aspect of the definition of man. Now, all this I say in order to indicate one thing, and that is the fact which all of you are acquainted with, that the law of survival or the principle of survival is not the only principle which determines man, but that man has that peculiar faculty to refuse the principle of survival in order to fulfill a human potential, something specifically human, the demands of his reason, the demands of his hope, the demands of his love, and that he is capable of preferring not to live instead of losing something which is his humanity. All these talks about about comparison between animal and men, and how man is a naked ape, and how man is like Lawrence gray goose, and the tropical fish, and this, that, and the other. They are all very nice, and perhaps quite comforting to some people. But they do forget that in the history of man, man's capacity not to act according to the principle of biological survival, but to act according to the principle of spiritual survival or affirmation, is indeed that very specific quality which man has. And strangely enough, while we all don't show much evidence for our willingness even to sacrifice or even to risk a $20,000 job when we can have a $15,000 job for reasons of honesty or integrity, we still insist to worship Christ, to admire Socrates, to admire Giordano Bruno, if we are a little bit familiar with philosophy, who did exactly this. The human race has been fascinated and has been moved by the men who did follow the principle of human affirmation, who did indeed act against the principle of biological survival because they were human, only that they have done very little to act like them, even when it was not at all life that is at stake, but just that second car, or whatever the equivalent is. One of the deep contradictions which we see in our life between what we admire and what we admire almost like an idol, because we admire it from afar and we ourselves are not touched. This is indeed the concept of the martyr in history. The concept of the martyr, and we might say in contrast to the concept of the hero. The hero, by and large, represents the man who risks his life, who is not deterred by danger in his battle for survival, usually not for his own personal survival, but for that of his tribe, his nation, his group. And that's what we usually call heroes. The martyr is the one who risks his life not for survival, but for the affirmation of that which is human. So the Buddhists and the Christians and the Jews have held that the martyrs are the greatest examples of human life, of that which man is capable of doing. Although in our day it seems that sometimes the hero becomes more admired than the martyr, and that is not surprising. The martyr, of course, can become an object of great admiration only in a culture for which spiritual values are very important. Why do I say very important? Are important. In a culture in which they are not, in which all that counts is biological survival, then indeed we have medals only for the heroes. Now I'm not detracting from the merits of the hero. I'm not detracting from his capacity to disregard his personal life in favor of that of a group. It's not the point I'm making here. The point is to see the difference and to see that we find here two types of models which have throughout history played a great role. The one affirming the biological principle and the other affirming the spiritual principle. Now, these were just some introductory remarks to come to the main point. And the main point is that man is, if you please, transcending himself, transcending the animal in himself in order to fulfill his humanity. Let me be more concrete. The animal spends most of his time to gather food. So do we. Now, of course, we don't do it in such a pleasant way that we go on a meadow and eat grass. We go in an office and type or do all sorts of things, but it's essentially food gathering. It's a little bit more indirect, but we consider as the only initiative for doing all this that we get what it takes to eat. And besides that, we are not satisfied just with food in order to live. We have created a whole world of human foods, to which belong the cars and the gadgets and the freezers and the any number of things which are presented to us every day, and the television sets and whatnot, but they are all foods because they are consumed. And you might say from this standpoint, man can be also defined as a homo consumens, as the being that consumes and is totally preoccupied with consumption. And yet, it seems that man, in all this occupation with food gathering, is not quite satisfied, that he is bored, that he feels that something is missing, and something indeed is missing, because he has an eye which can see artistically, he has an ear which can appreciate music, he has a heart which can feel love and tenderness, and he has a brain which can think more than that which is necessary to create new food. All that, if all that is left alone, if is unused, then indeed man feels cheated. He feels that life is trivial, that life is boring. In many cultures, of course, you have a life which is not like that, where food gathering is not the main purpose, or where it was left to the slaves, like, let us say, in Athens. Well, of course, I am not approving of this solution, but although an authority like Aristotle did, but the point is that we do our food gathering more or less ourselves, but we become slaves ourselves, not in the sense of being forced, of being driven, of being chained, or being this, that, or the other, but of having no time, no energy, nor freedom to transcend the activity of slaves, which is the activity of food gathering. In cultures in which men transcends this, you have music, you have drama, you have dance, you have art in all forms, you have experiences which are an essential part of man's life, which fulfill his specifically human potential. And indeed, you might say, human life is meaningful only inasmuch as it gives birth to human faculties. in which man can transcend his food gathering biological necessities or physiological necessities and realize that which exists in him as a potential, that human potential I was talking about before. In our society, there's little of this. So we have an enormous wish for the dramatic, for that which transcends the boredom of daily routine. How do we fulfill it? By cheap movies, by the fact that when there's an automobile accident, 100 people will gather and stare to see the dead or the wounded. By much of the crimes which attract people when they read it in the newspaper, or by what you can see tonight at 11 probably when you look at the news of people killed and maimed in Vietnam. That is to say, we have created the cheapest form of the dramatic because we have failed to create that which makes human life, if you please, dramatic, transcend itself in higher forms. Now, some of you will say, but what about our museums? What about our symphony concerts and the many people who go there? The figures are indeed impressive. But I have my doubts. It's a very decent way of killing time. We are indoctrinated to listen to music and to appreciate it. We are indoctrinated, and that depends on the special circle you live in, whether you appreciate Rembrandt or whether you appreciate modern art, whatever it may be. The question is how deep all this moves you, how deep all this goes, or whether it is essentially something which is a response of your thought to signals which are given to you by the culture. That is what you're supposed to like. If it had a much deeper influence, I don't think people would ever listen to television. Their taste would be so much better. They would be so impatient with the ugliness and stupidity of what they see that they just couldn't hear it. And yet, it must be that the millions of people who go to the concerts and to the art galleries are at the same time the millions who listen in the evening or whenever they have time to television. So I cannot imagine that all this mass consumption of culture has really the influence which the figures would make us believe it has. All this I have said to explain something about one important source of destructiveness which transcends the rational destructiveness I have been talking before. Namely, destructiveness also can be a passion in which man transcends the humdrum, the boredom, the triviality of everyday life. If you study the feelings of soldiers, not usually the soldiers who fight in a normal war, but the soldiers, let us say, who were fighting in 1919 in Germany in the so-called free corps, in the volunteers who fought, who were practically Nazis. These people were obsessed completely by the experience, by the overwhelming experience of fighting, of killing or being killed. You might say something snaps suddenly, and life becomes at a certain point completely uninteresting. They are not deterred anymore by danger. On the contrary, this risk of one's own life becomes the most exciting thing because one has given up the interest in all that serves survival, in all that serves food gathering. You find it for good and bad purposes, or for better or worse purposes. You find it in the Algerians who fought for their freedom in Algiers, and you find it among the French paratroopers who fought the Algerians. And you find it in the soldiers of the NLF in South Vietnam, on Vietnam and North Vietnam. And if one does not understand that there are people for whom the amenities of life, the security of living, the pleasant boredom of life, or the boring pleasantness of life has ceased to be interesting, then indeed one does not understand that these people are not deterred by losing 100 men or 1,000 men a day and by being bombed out. On the contrary, you saw something of in a much minor degree in London during the Blitz. There's a very interesting fact that in London during the Blitz, there were less neurotic symptoms, less psychosomatic symptoms. The people felt, in many respects, healthier and better than in peacetime. Because there too, the Londoners during the Blitz, while they did not have the experience of this blood drunkenness, which I'm describing here, of certain types of soldiers, had a complete decisiveness, that they were not to yield. And this gave life a new dimension, a new interest, a new affirmation. And this interest itself was that made them feel better. Anybody who is interested in something which goes beyond food gathering feels better, stronger, more alive than the person who is concerned with food gathering, the car, and security all the time. Of course, why people get into this mood were something, as I said, snaps, and where the whole personality in one moment becomes completely devoted to acts of hostility or acts of courage, like the Londoners, of withstanding hostility, or of real blood drunkenness, as you find it in some places. There are many reasons. For instance, when you take one main reason is that people are thrown out of life, who are greatly frustrated, who have no chance for the comfortable, convenient, pleasant life, will often be the ones who throw themselves into this new mood of passion, of hostility, while the people who have a nice life, a convenient life, a comfortable life, will do so less. This holds true individually, it holds true for nations. Indeed, it is a very sad commentary on our culture that many people in war feel happier than they feel in peace. Because the soldier, not the people at home, although because they really are the ones who fear for the life of those who are in the battle. But many of the soldiers are suddenly freed from all trivialities of life, and they are completely devoted to something which gives them a purpose which transcends the triviality of life, even though it is killing or being killed. In fact, I think one might say that only if we have a culture in which life is as interesting as war will we be able to eradicate war. Now, there is indeed a peculiar kind of rhythm in the two moods. In the mood of the daily life, where everything is smooth, where we avoid tragedy, where we avoid the dramatic, where we want to be secure, and the moments in which we break through this and fulfill our wish for, you might say, the dramatic, for the extraordinary, for the specifically human. And there are two ways probably in which this happens. One, that this human fulfillment is sought for in a constant way. That is to say, it's not one sudden experience, but it is something which permeates all of life. You find that, for instance, in some respects in the idea of traditional religious Jewish life, which is of course not that of lighting candles on the Friday night and going to the synagogue on the highest holidays for ancestor worship. This is not what the Jewish tradition was about, but where the whole of life was supposed to be something deeply permeated, deeply touched by the human, or, if you please, the psycho-spiritual. You have the same phenomenon, of course, in the monastic life of Christianity. And you have in this monastic life a remarkable sign of a remarkable example of decentralization, including that many people would go to their small church and not to the big cathedral, because there they felt at home. This was very real and not a mass phenomenon. And you have it in Buddhism, in the Buddhist monastery, and you have it particularly in Zen Buddhism, in the whole idea of enlightenment. Enlightenment is supposed to be something which although it may start suddenly, but from then on means a different human situation. As the Zen Buddhists sometimes express it, for first the mountains are mountains and the rivers are rivers. Then the mountains are not more mountains and the rivers are not more any more rivers. But then the mountains are again mountains and the rivers are again rivers. Now that may sound perhaps a little complex or nonsensical to you. This is the way Zen Buddhists talk. What they really mean is life remains the same and yet it is not the same, because life has assumed an entirely new quality. As Dr. Suzuki once said, to have enlightenment means just to walk as everybody walks, but just half an inch above the ground. It's just a different form of experience. It is a form of experience which is never trivial, which is relatively constant, which does not permit of banality and of triviality, because it is always human, penetrating, intense. And if some of you will think, especially the younger ones, well, this is just a fairy tale, such a thing isn't possible, then indeed, all I can say is that there are many people, and there have been still more people, who have just lived that way. We are losing touch with that tradition. Now, the other form of solving the problem is not what in some sense one might call the Apollinian form, which I just described, but the Dionysian form, the form of ecstasis. That is to say, not something which is built into life as a constant process, as a constant attitude, but something which is sudden and stands out by itself and happens many times, but it is not part of the normal process of life. And that is what you might call ecstasis, to be outside of oneself or beside oneself. Now, the ecstatic experience is in some way similar to what I described before, or rather, in what I described, I anticipated somewhat parts of the ecstatic experience, of the experience in which a person is completely transformed in a sense that he is not himself anymore. There's a state of complete union, of the disappearance of thought and of reason. There is a state which you might call trance, which you might call orgiastic, and which these days people call to be turned on, which is perhaps a simpler way of putting it, except that it is usually supposed to be possible only with the help of drugs. Now, ecstatic experience is a very peculiar kind of experience which for some people individually and for some cultures socially is the specific form in which they experience the human, the dramatic, the transcending. They are not themselves anymore. They are outside of themselves. If you see a crowd, and you have it in many more primitive cultures than in ours, getting into a frenzy by rhythm or by drugs or liquor, or by some sort of sexual orgy, or by any number of techniques which suddenly make this person and the whole crowd transform them completely into something completely different from normal existence. And there you have the state of ecstasis. Now, you have that in many cultures, and you have it today. You have it also sometimes in mystical union, in the mystical experience, although there are very different kinds of mystical experiences. I was speaking before of the one which is not ecstatic in this sense, but which is one in which the person is transformed basically in his whole attitude. Well, I speak here of ecstasies because there is one particular form of ecstasis which has to do a great deal with destructiveness, and it goes a step beyond what I've been describing before, namely the drama of fighting, of blood, of dying, of all that is different from the humdrum life of food gathering. I'm speaking now of a particular kind of ecstasies, and that is the ecstasies of omnipotence. That is the experience of transcending the limitations of human existence by having complete omnipotence, by not only eliminating awareness and thought, but also by eliminating the limitations of powerlessness or the limitations of human power. In other words, there is an ecstasy of having complete control over the whole world, over human beings, over animals, over things. If you like, the ecstasies of being God, and were it only for one moment, an hour, or a day. Some of this has been described by Freud when he spoke of sadism. Now, Freud always assumed that sadism is essentially a phase of sexual development, of libido development, and that it was in its nature a form of sexuality in which, however, the wish to hurt or to overpower was particularly strong. But it was it was rooted in the sexual drive. I do not believe that Freud is right in this. I think, on the contrary, that sadism is an expression of a wish to control when it is still mixed with sexual, and you might say in that sense, life forces. It is quite unpleasant, but at least it is, by its mixture with life forces, in some ways still belonging to life and not to death. But the essence of all sadism is not at all its sexual nature, but its wish for complete control over another human being. The wish to strangle life, to make another being my object, that I can do with him whatever I like. And what more power could I have over another being than to make him suffer and to force him to accept the suffering I inflict upon him? I have written about this at some length in an earlier book, Escape from Freedom, in which I try to show that sadism is by its very nature control, complete control, unconditioned control, and not in itself sexual, although it can be combined with or connected with sexual desire. But the sadism of which Freud spoke, of which Freud thought, was a relatively harmless version of the ecstasy of omnipotence, compared with that ecstasy of omnipotence which turns out to be one of the most destructive forces in man. Let me give an example. Some of you, I'm sure, have read Camus' play Caligula. And if you haven't, then it was worth coming tonight if you read it. Here is a Roman Caesar who is not crazy in the beginning. He's just a man with so much power that he slowly falls for the illusion or the delusion that he really transcends the normal conditions of human existence, and that he is not subject anymore to the limitations of the relative powerlessness of man. And so he forms the idea which Camus expresses in the word, I want the moon. So he humiliates all senators. I'm speaking of Rome. He humiliates all senators. He makes himself to be a person who does not know how to escape the logic of his own power. And indeed, this was Rome and not the United States, because this role of power which was given to the Roman Caesar in those days is something which does not exist in the United States. And eventually we see this Caligula in the play of Camus becoming mad. And the interesting thing which Caligula shows is that the man is not really sick. It's a way of life. It's a way of life into which he was tempted and seduced by the power which was rooted in the system, in which the power of the Caesar had no limitations. Now, of course, that possibility depends entirely on the social structure of the society, of a tribe, whether any single man is given such power. And indeed, it would be very dangerous. in all cases, is usually very dangerous. But you find the same mechanism in another way where human destructiveness is very visible, and that is what you might call, or what I call, the raping, looting, destroying orgy, where you find soldiers, and this happened throughout history, who conquer a city, who rape all women, destroy everything and steal what they can. This usually lasts only 3 days because the authorities don't want to make them feel that they are gods longer than 3 days, because the discipline suffers if this goes on too long, and they might not obey their own officers anymore. But for 3 days, this is traditional. This was a case in the Roman wars. This was a case in medieval wars. This we have seen, the older ones of us, at any rate, in the famous rape of Nanking by the Japanese soldiers. We have seen it in the behavior of Russian soldiers in East Prussia and in Berlin at the end of the last war. Suddenly, the little man who never had a chance to feel like a god, who always was powerless, impotent, who had nothing to say, by the fact that he becomes the victor, is suddenly see the possibility, even if it's for 1 day, to be God. It's not so simple as one often thinks, that these acts of rape, for instance, are the expression of the pent-up sexual desire. It is indiscriminate, it is senseless, and it is connected with other acts which are part of this complex, namely to steal and to destroy what you can't carry away. In other words, in this complex you find people who suddenly find themselves in the role of complete omnipotence vis-à-vis of a population which they have conquered, and who go through the orgy of omnipotence, through the ecstasis of omnipotence, and become at this time extremely destructive. Now, if we ask for the reasons for this kind of, for this omnipotence, for this wish for omnipotence, then indeed, I think the general reason is precisely the sense of impotence which the person has in his real life. The wish for omnipotence and sadism are the answer to the sense of powerlessness and impotence in real life. And the less impotent, the less powerless people feel, the less they are inclined to have to compensate by the sense of power over others. It is almost the rule that the sadist is a man who feels very powerless, and who has the only chance of feeling not powerless by becoming the ruler of somebody, very often only his dog, sometimes his children. There is usually somebody on whom you can vent your sadism because he is too helpless to fight back. And the sadist is never courageous, because the essence of his, if you please, perversion in an emotional sense is precisely that his pleasure lies in the complete power over another person. And therefore, the more powerless a person is, the more attractive he is for his own sadistic impulses. What I have tried to add here to the description of human destructiveness then is that kind of destructiveness of hostility which is truly irrational, which does not serve survival, and which is using hostility as getting as breaking through the monotony and triviality of life, or in the ecstatic form as one experience which can serve as the core of ecstasies, just as drugs, rhythm, or sex can. It is the cheapest form. It is the form which requires least art, least effort, and least humanity. But in a deeper sense, it is still human, because it's still the protest of a human being who does not want to die like a dog, if I may quote from the end of The Trial by Kafka. The other form of destructiveness is one, as I said last time, which I've called necrophilia, an entirely different form of destructiveness, an attraction to all that is dead, that is decaying, that is not alive, to all that is mechanical. But I have already expressed my apology for suggesting to you that you buy The Heart of Man, I think it's 125 in a paperback edition, to read what I have said, what I would have said in another lecture if I had one more. Now, I should like to mention that if we consider hostility and human destructiveness, that then we find a peculiar process of triggering. That is to say, hostility born out of defense may trigger the hostility of the bloodlust, and it may trigger the hostility of the ecstatic hostility of sadism. What you see is that in people, the greatest barrier is to make the step from normal life to acts of destruction. Once the first act of destruction has been committed, then those who have a deep yearning for the ecstasies of sadism or for the transcendence of killing and being killed can proceed because it has been triggered by the first step. The normal inhibitions don't exist anymore. And that's what you find in every war. You find in every war, let us say in great national wars, that the majority of soldiers do not even hate. They fight back because they go into the war because it's a job. They fight back because they defend their lives. But a small percentage become are soldiers who kill, who find their satisfaction in killing, or who find their satisfaction in the ecstasies of sadism. The Nazis had their own way of regulating that. By setting up their special formations of people, of soldiers who killed innocent people, they drew from the whole army those men who volunteered for these special formations, who were the true sadists. And so you find there was a great deal of difference, by and large, between the behavior of the army and the behavior of the special formation, which were the people for whom killing and the ecstasies of sadism was the fulfillment of a deep wish because of their own deep sense of impotence. You might say also, looking at this picture, that our culture, and so the culture of all industrial states, regardless of whether they call themselves capitalist or communist, are threatened by an immense danger. And that is that man becomes more and more mechanized, more and more automatized, more and more mechanic, and that unlived life seeks revenge by destruction. That as a result of ever-increasing boredom, there come explosions of violence and hate. Because if one cannot transcend life by creating in a creative way, then one can always transcend life by destruction. Because destroying life is almost or is as much of a miracle as creating life. Only that to create life, to create anything alive, requires activity, imagination. It requires all that is human. While any fool can destroy life. But at the very moment in which he destroys life, he can feel himself like God, because he can undo that which, if you please, God or life has done in the process of creation. And unless we, in our culture, find ways of overcoming increasing boredom, of overcoming increasing mechanization, and making food gathering in its various forms the main aim of life, I'm afraid we shall witness the outbreak of such deep violence that it might destroy our whole culture. Even our playing with the idea, with the weapons of nuclear war, even our claims that we might win a nuclear war if necessary, are already beyond rational thought. Because what winning here means is, of course, as many people have observed, nothing but we might be destroyed, and we have then the satisfaction that our enemies are destroyed at the same moment. But this is already going beyond survival. It's already a bankruptcy of human existence. But even in this bankruptcy, man shows himself as human, because he shows that he reacts to his inability to create. He reacts to his inability to feel, to be moved, to have joy, to be touched, and to share deep human experiences with others. So we might say human existence and as human existence has two possible outcomes. One is the creation of culture, of art, of all products of human creativity, and the other is destructiveness. The destructiveness is as much human as is creativity. It takes place almost with certainty when man fails in being human in a creative and positive sense. We then come to the conclusion that, at least I do, that the psychological causes of destructiveness are not those which are cited by Lawrence and by Freud and by the author of The Naked Ape, namely the urge for human destructiveness, the instinct for destructiveness, which is ever flowing and ever increasing and so on. But they are quite different. The psychological causes for destructiveness are suggestibility, gullibility, and lack of individuality. They lie in a power structure in which few decide on war who do not have a clear enough awareness of where their acts lead to. They lie in the fact of the boredom of existence and the absence of drama and depth in culture. They lie in the fact of human impotence and powerlessness, which is the basis for sadism and the that destructiveness which becomes the exclusive aim of life. Indeed, to speak of something recent, I do not believe that the so-called race riots have shown a great deal of destructiveness. To loot a few stores and to burn a few buildings is something which is not the result, in my opinion, of the depth of destructiveness which man is capable of. This is a relatively harmless byproduct of a situation which is unusual, which is critical, and in which people in some way behave as they would on a holiday, on a carnival, in which they break through the normal boundaries which are set for human behavior. If many Negroes would have gone downtown and would have killed 100 or 200 and 500 white people, risking their lives and being willing to die, then indeed it would have been, then we would deal with real destructiveness. And then indeed, if the police would have shot many of these people, we would have and we could have a snowballing of destructiveness to which there is no end, in which people suddenly feel there is no more sense to living except killing, except revenge, except getting back at injustice. And indeed, it's a crucial problem for America and for the world, whether violence will become the dominant pattern or life. But you cannot preach non-violence unless you offer life, unless you offer hope, and not only you offer it, but you show ways and means in which hope can be anchored, in which hope makes sense and is not a farce. I believe that the whole problem of non-violence cannot simply be dealt with as violence against non-violence as a matter of principle, but it must be dealt with in the larger context of hope and the increase of joy and interest in life. Otherwise, violence will occur because it is one of the possibilities in man, precisely because he is human, and precisely because, being human, he wants to transcend the hopelessness of a trivial existence. Well, what we could do, many people think these days we can do very little. Maybe we can do very little. I think we can, first of all, be alive ourselves, be critical ourselves, make use of all existing possibilities in favor of a principle of life and hope. And right now we have in the United States a rather interesting period where something takes place which usually is only a ritual, namely the election of a president. Well, I think then what we can do is to select the candidates, or maybe I should leave out the S and the plural, who seem to be most alive. And this indeed may make a great deal of difference for the future of America and the world. Thank you. And then we shall have 10 minutes pause and then questions. Here's a question. Were the so-called spiritual cultures of the East just compensating for a hopeless poverty and lack of political freedom? Is there progress in history toward human creativity and fulfillment? Well, this is a question which is a formulation, a slightly different formulation of a number of other questions which have essentially the same meaning. In the first place, let's not forget, if we take human culture, human history, when it began to take an entirely new course, namely to look forward to a vision of the development of human human powers rather than to regression to nature, to magic, to remaining bound to the soil and to mere tradition. Well, maybe that all started around 1500. It's a very peculiar thing. You have the Egyptian revolution of Akhenaton around 1400. You have Moses around the same time. Then you have around 500 Buddha and the prophets and the great Greek philosophers. And there is very little reason to assume that they influenced each other. It's one of the mysteries of history, how 500 BC in various parts of the world the same ideas flowered in different concepts. And from then on to now is, historically speaking, just a second. Yes. When people think man has made little progress, it is like a mother who would see her child, her baby, at 8 o'clock in the morning, and at 8:20 she would get very anxious that the child has changed so little. It is remarkable that man has changed tremendously from the caveman, from primitive culture, from animal-bound culture, to that development which we see in the last 3,500 years. Now, that we have to take pretty much as one moment. We cannot look for great changes. In fact, it has repeated itself. The same themes have repeated itself. There were slight changes. There were geographical changes in which centers of culture moved from one to the other place. But by and large, I think you have to take the Indian, the Egyptian, the Near East, the Greek, and later on the medieval and Renaissance culture as one piece. This is one expression, and so far the best of human achievement. Now, as to the question whether the Indian ideas of spirituality are only a compensation of their poverty, well, I'm afraid that's one of those reductionist ideas in which everything is explained as a compensation of a lack. And I don't think it's very likely if you consider the fact that the same ideas have been held under conditions where there was no suffering in poverty, whether that is, in Greek thinking or in late medieval thinking or in Renaissance thinking, or in the thinking of monastic life in the 12th and 13th century, or the thinking of the Renaissance humanists. Well, it would take too long to go through this process. I recommend again to read Louis Mumford's book, The Myth of the Machine. There you will find very important answers to all these considerations. How do your biological principle and spiritual principle differ from Freud's pleasure principle and reality principle? Well, I don't quite know what is compared here. Freud's reality principle is really the principle of survival. He says man wants pleasure, but that for him is essentially the instinctive pleasure of the instincts, or rather the getting away from unpleasure, from the unpleasure of tension, while the reality principle serves essentially the survival of the individual. So this has really no parallel to the difference between what I call the food gathering, or the or according to Freud, really the reality principle of survival, and the specifically human principle, which is precisely not the pleasure principle, because the pleasure principle is a principle rooted in instincts and in the whole idea that the instincts, and especially the sexual instinct, creates tension, and then man needs to get rid of this tension. Do you see hope for small communities existing outside of institutional life? This is a very interesting point these days. I'm sure many of you have observed that there is a tendency in the last few years, it seems increasing every day, for non-organized, non-bureaucratic action. I don't think that the occupation of the Columbia University building is necessarily the only form, or perhaps even the most constructive form, of the spontaneous action, although that constitutes a very serious and complicated problem. But you find, for instance, in the primaries in New Hampshire, in which suddenly a man without a machine, without an organization, by this very fact attracts the enthusiasm of thousands and thousands of people. It seems at the moment that many Americans are, and I consider this one of the most hopeful signs, exactly attracted by that which is not organizational, that which people undertake because they rely on themselves, because they don't wait for the top gorilla to lead them, because they don't wait for the bureaucracy. You see, for instance, here in Harlem, a wonderful experiment which Monsignor Fox has done in the 40 streets in Harlem, going out there, sending out artists, and people do murals and paint their houses and do all sorts of things with a spirit. They do something. This doesn't mean that this will solve the slum problem. But indeed, the solution of the slum problem, I believe, cannot be done in a purely bureaucratic way either. Better housing in itself with dead people is not the solution for making people alive. Better housing is for people who are alive. And to make people alive is not done only by building. And that, I think, is something which Americans more and more tend to feel. You read perhaps in the New York Times the other day a report of many, they are not secret, they are very autonomous Catholic groups who meet to form their own community, who have their own rituals. Well, again, who are not impressed by the need to follow a bureaucracy. Well, in fact, if you take the whole development of the Catholic Church, it's an anti-bureaucratic development, which you see in that wing of the Catholic Church which became so strong since Pope John, and which finds its expression in some of the most learned and most profound Catholic theologians, especially Jesuit priests. It seems there is no country in the world, as far as I can see, which is so ready to be critical of bureaucracy and of organization in the United States. There are countries which would have more reason even than we have to be so critical. That's the Russians. They have still more bureaucracy and a still more inefficient bureaucracy than ours. Although ours is not too efficient either. But they are still frightened. Americans are, at the moment, it seems to me, in that wonderful state where they are not frightened and yet very critical. If this point is passed in the direction either of stopping to be critical or beginning to be frightened, then I'm afraid we are at a very bad situation. Your psychological roots of destruction seem to be more sociological and cultural than psychological. What about rejection, emotional deprivation, and alienation as causes of hostility? What about hatred, revenge, jealousy as particularly human forms of hostility? Well, I am afraid it would take me too long to answer this question I would like to answer it because it's a very serious question. I answer it in a way, I'm writing a book on this topic of these lectures, and I hope they have a chance to answer it. But I should like to say a word about it at least. I do speak about psychological problems. The difference is what one considers some of the most profound psychological motivations. Now, the writer of this note mentions What about rejection? Well, yes, rejection can create hostility. And if I had the time to talk about it, I would have talked about rejection. But rejection, like frustration, and I have this even in my notes tonight and had no time to talk about frustration, by themselves do not necessarily cause hostility. I mentioned this, I think, last time. One person is rejected if there is enough interest in life, if there is enough activity in him. All right, it's very sad. Already Heine has written a poem about that one's heart breaks if the beloved one stops to love one. But nevertheless, one does not react with rage, with hostility, unless there is a deep emptiness. And there's a great difference between the empty person who clings to another person like a lifesaver, and therefore who becomes very hostile because he feels threatened, and the person who loves somebody, who feels sad but doesn't become hostile. In other words, it's not the rejection per se which creates hostility, but the rejection under certain conditions. Now that holds true also for emotional deprivation. It all depends how one is deprived, when, but again, it's a phenomenon within a larger context. Neither frustration per se, nor rejection per se, nor emotional deprivation per se create hostility. They create it only within a whole system, and perhaps there would be hostility under all circumstances because the person is frightened, impotent, feels impotent, helpless, and furious. Now, then there is the writer mentions alienation. Well, alienation is precisely one of the topics which I have dealt with, although I have not used the word alienation, I think, except in terms of the connection with idolatry. Alienation simply means of losing the feeling or the sense of one's own aliveness as the active center of one's own activities. Or, as you might say, the sense of one's own identity. That I cannot say I'm I anymore in a meaningful way, but I am me. That is to say, I am that object which I can describe as Mr. So-and-so, who can be defined as an object just as a Ford car can be described as an object. In other words, the difference between the writer of this question, myself, is perhaps not as great as it seems to be, but perhaps it is very great. It all depends. But I cannot accept from my standpoint that what I'm talking about is not psychology. I would say all psychology is related to a number of very important social and cultural data which partly cause the formation or malformation of man, partly result from it, which interact with the emotional powers in man. But after all, what I was talking about was precisely the dynamics within man in which destructiveness is caused by a number of factors, namely by the defense against threats, by the need to transcend the average, the food-gathering life, by the need for ecstasis, or by the attachment to all that is dead. Now, these are all psychological data. Here's a question: what is it about sex that makes you consider it a low form of life expression? Now, I am not aware, never intended to, I never thought that sex was a low form of life expression. I think sex is really the prototype of the ecstatic experience. You might say this is what nature has delivered free to all men. And in fact, one of the few things which society usually cannot deprive people of. And in this prototype, you find indeed all the elements of overcoming one's egocentricity, of ecstatic feeling, and of many of the things which I described as part of the important human experiences. However, I did not put it into the center or as a top phenomenon for specifically human fulfillment, because it is so related to human experiences, to love, to hate, to narcissism, to indifference. It is so much a requirement of nature. Nature uses this trick for its own purposes of survival, that in many, many, many ways and in cases, sex is a relatively mild, weak, and unsatisfactory form, relatively speaking, of that which man is seeking for. Well, and you have the proof for it. I mean, actually, sex is the one thing. You could say at Freud's time, so it's repressed. So man is unhappy because sex is repressed. And if it were not repressed, how happy would man be? That's what a writer like William Reich still thought not so long ago. But now it's not repressed anymore. And so people are just as bored. You don't see the afterglow of happiness and joy in all these people who have no particular restriction to their sexual activities. So it cannot be quite that meaningful, but I did not speak of it as a low form of life expression. Thank God that nature has given man at least a prototype for the simplest form of purposeless and, if you like, ecstatic experience, but it is so simple that sometimes it does not quite fulfill the purpose. I was asked a question whether the flower children, that is to say the hippies, are an expression of power or of powerlessness. Well, this is really a very difficult question to answer, because I think in a way they are both. They are an expression of inner power because there are people who have the courage to say no, at least to convention, although their own conventions tend to be rather conventional too. I mean, there's a convention of wearing a tie and a convention of not wearing a tie. But not wearing a tie, if this is a requirement, is another kind of uniform. And I gather if I found out, in the meantime, I was speaking on various colleges, if I really want to go to some parties of the young people, I do have to carry with me a sport jacket and something and sports shirts, because otherwise I just don't have the right dress. Well, so the unconventionality of this is a little bit questionable. Nevertheless, there is more than unconventionality. There is a seeking for something very human, for love, for truth, for something transcending the humdrum life. But there is also something so self-limiting in it, because it's usually connected with drugs. It's without a program, without much thought, without much widening of the horizon. It's terribly individualistic. And I don't think it is convincing enough to touch the large number of Americans who want life and not boredom in a significant way, which could lead to a change in American institutions and an American way of life. And in that sense, it is powerless. In another sense, it's not powerless because it is nevertheless impressive in its honesty, in its integrity. And it's a very interesting phenomenon today, as many of you know, that there are many people today, older people, who are influenced politically by their children at the age of 17, 18, 19. It happens in Germany, where the son of the foreign minister, Brandt, was arrested the other day and carried into prison because he is against the policy which his father represents. Well, it has happened in America many, many times. And perhaps, and I have to stop here, I could say one thing which is related to this question. it seems to me and to many other observers that what is today one of the most deeply sought things is genuineness and honesty. People look for people who have no credibility gap. I don't mean that only in terms of politics, but in terms of their whole personality. It doesn't really matter so much whether a person has a somewhat this or that doctrine or concept. But I think people have today, more than ever before, and especially the young generation, a very critical mind and a capacity to understand who is genuine, who means what he says, and who doesn't. And they are very sensitive to it. And it is a very interesting fact that their elders have a sense of shame or embarrassment to be caught in their lies. And that out of that embarrassment, they are even willing to concede a great deal to the young generation, because they have a sense of the rightness of the accusation leveled against them, although they themselves are in many ways just the objects of a whole social situation which they were powerless to control or to change. But if one asks, what is today one of the most potent forces, aside from this force of the individual activity, I believe it is a new awareness of integrity, a new awareness of a new critique of the talking about spiritual values and whether they are meant or whether they are phrases. And I think in all various groups which cut through religions and political concepts and parties, there are people who wake up to take their ideas seriously, and others who are afraid because they know if they would examine themselves, there would be nothing. And so they call for the police, as the mayor of Chicago does. Our mayor here has shown he is not afraid because he dares to go out and face people. And this seems to be a symbol of one of the new things which happen in the United States, and which indeed are the only ones which could check the tremendous danger of not just violence, that is nothing, but of a wave of destructiveness which could occur if the human elements are not growing in a greater speed than the destructive elements do. Thank you.